In 1994, everyone was looking forward to what promised to be the most legendary duel in Formula One history. Senna versus Schumacher, the legend against the future, the most feared three-time champion of his era against the young prodigy who had come to change everything. But the weekend at Imola didn't deliver a showdown, it delivered a tragedy that no one would ever forget. On Friday, a driver nearly died after a brutal accident. On Saturday, another crashed at over 300 kilometers per hour and never opened his eyes again. And on Sunday, the greatest driver of his generation crashed into a wall and became the second driver of the weekend to lose his life. All of that happened during the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, and no one did anything. Not the FIA, not the teams, not the organizers. The race wasn't suspended, nor was the event canceled, because stopping it meant losing millions of dollars. And everyone who could have stopped it chose the same thing, to protect the business over the lives of the drivers. That's why the warnings were ignored, information was manipulated, and the deaths were covered up. The result, the longest, most frustrating, and most unfair trial in the history of the sport. 11 years that ended with no one found guilty and no convictions. Even though the evidence was clear, this Grand Prix exposed the worst side of motorsport. A tragedy that paralyzed an entire country and left it in mourning. A tragedy that everyone saw coming and that could and should have been avoided. But that, out of pure greed, no one wanted to stop. Today, I'll tell you everything that happened during the most tragic weekend in Formula One history. The tragedies, the terrible decisions that were made, who was responsible and what the consequences were. And stay until the end so you understand how these events changed the history of the sport forever. The 1994 season began with a surprise that no one saw coming. Benetton victory, Michael Schumacher from Germany, Michael Schumacher.
Winston.
Pacific Grand Prix, Michael Schumacher was dominating convincingly and was leading the championship after winning the first two races. Ayrton Senna, on the other hand, had not scored a single point yet. 2 consecutive retirements left him under enormous pressure and with growing anxiety to turn the situation around.
I'm starting from scratch, so basically our championship starts here. It's not a comfortable position to be in, but that's the reality.
But the most worrying thing wasn't the results, but the context. That year, the FIA decided to eliminate all electronic aids, traction control, active suspension, and assisted brakes. Formula One became about the drivers again, but it also left them more exposed than ever. The idea was to level the competition and stop the advantage of the wealthier teams, like Williams, who had dominated in 1992 and 1993 thanks to those technologies. Because of that dominance, for 1994, Senna signed with the British team looking for exactly that, to unite the best driver with the best team. Everything pointed to a season of absolute dominance by Senna. However, no one expected what was about to happen. On the other hand, many warned that removing technology without redesigning the cars was going to be a disaster, and the Williams car was the perfect proof of that. It was fast, yes, but also nervous and unpredictable. Senna felt it was unstable, and he showed it in every test lap, where he fought more to keep it on track than to push it to the limit. In the first 2 races, he suffered spins and retirements. Both he and his teammate Damon Hill expressed their frustration. The car was extremely difficult to drive, but the difference between them was clear. Senna faced those problems with a skill far above the rest and did everything he could to try to adapt. He tested in Nogaro, gave instructions, and demanded changes. He also made it clear that he didn't like the position of the steering wheel or the steering column. Because of that, he asked the team to adjust everything, and Williams agreed, but they didn't redesign anything. They simply cut the original column and welded it with an extra piece to make it longer, an improvised solution. Despite the changes, Senna was not at ease and wasn't afraid to say so. In an interview, he said,
"More cars spinning, going off the track, more excitement for the audience. For us, until something happens, nothing happens. It's not very comfortable."
The worst part is he wasn't alone in feeling that way. Several drivers questioned the safety. They didn't know how the cars would respond without the aids, and no one fully trusted what they were driving. Despite that, the season went on, the races continued, and everyone crossed their fingers hoping nothing would happen. The first sign came on Friday with a terrible accident that should have stopped everything. In the middle of the qualifying session, Rubens Barrichello lost control of his car at the Bassa chicane. He crashed violently against the edge of an improvised chicane when he was going over 225 kilometers per hour. His car took off, crashed into the barriers, and flipped several times in the air before landing and coming to a stop upside down. Barrichello was unconscious. He had swallowed his tongue and he wasn't moving.
I was dead for 6 minutes and not breathing.
The Brazilian stated this years later.
I spent a month without remembering my wife, so I must have really died.
The doctors acted immediately. Among them was Sid Watkins, the neurosurgeon who had been fighting for safety in Formula One for years. And thanks to him, Rubens survived. But for Senna, this was a very hard blow. Rubens Barrichello was more than just a fellow countryman. He was his close friend. He had known him since he was a child. He had paid for his first karting competitions, and now he saw him in a critical situation. That's why when he heard about the accident, he ran to the hospital and stayed there until Barrichello opened his eyes. It's no wonder that the first person Rubens saw when he woke up was Ayrton. After making sure his friend was safe, Senna went back to the paddock and answered the following when asked about his fellow countryman's condition.
He's fine. He's in shock, of course, but he's fine.
Barrichello was lucky. He only had a sprained wrist and a fractured nose. Senna, for his part, went back to the track. And despite a spin, he set the fastest time on Friday, but his mind was elsewhere. Formula One, on the other hand, showed no concern at all. The session was not suspended, and no one questioned anything. The accident was brutal, but not enough. After his injuries, Barrichello didn't get back in the car that weekend. It was only Friday, but everyone already knew something wasn't right. That something terrible could happen at any moment. But before we continue, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe. On Saturday, the tragedy stopped being just a warning and became reality. Roland Ratzenberger was a rookie. A passionate man who fought for years to make it to the series, and who was finally living his dream. But that Saturday, everything changed. During qualifying, his car suffered damage to the front wing, and on the next lap, the wing came off when he was going over 300 kilometers per hour. So the car lost aerodynamic downforce, and it became unstable, uncontrollable. Ratzenberger couldn't turn or brake, and he went straight into a concrete wall at the Villeneuve corner at 314 kilometers per hour. The impact was devastating, and death was instantaneous. The session was stopped immediately. The doctors arrived in less than a minute, and Dr. Sid Watkins joined quickly. Everyone saw that Roland was motionless, and the tension was overwhelming, but no one said anything. When Senna found out, he got into a safety car and broke protocol. He went straight to the scene of the accident. He saw the body, the shattered helmet, the blood, and the silence. Because of this action, race control reprimanded him, to which Ayrton simply replied, "Someone has to care." After what happened, the FIA, instead of suspending qualifying, did something much worse. And this is where everything gets very dark. According to Italian law, if someone dies during a sporting event, it must be cancelled immediately and a criminal investigation is launched. So, to avoid that, they decided not to declare Ratzenberger's death at the circuit. They airlifted him to the hospital. It was a cover-up, a deliberate decision. Another proof that the show was worth more than a life. Finally, the Austrian driver's death was publicly confirmed, and Senna was devastated. He cried on the shoulder of Sid Watkins, his friend and personal doctor. Watkins tried to convince him not to race on Sunday. In a conversation that could have completely changed the fate of the Brazilian driver.
the fastest driver. He won the championship so many times. Let's go fishing.
He knew something was wrong, and Ayrton Senna, one of the fastest men in the world, began to feel more vulnerable than ever. Sunday dawned with absolute silence in the paddock. It wasn't just out of respect for Roland. There was an almost unbearable tension. A mix of grief, fear, and resignation. On the morning of May 1st, the drivers gathered as always before the race. And before starting, they observed a minute of silence for Ratzenberger. Some barely knew him, but everyone knew what it meant, what happened to him. It could also happen to any of them. The conversation was intense. They discussed safety measures, and they agreed to reactivate the GPDA, the Drivers' Association that had been inactive for years. Senna led the initiative. Along with Gerhard Berger and Michael Schumacher, he would serve as one of the first 3 directors. The idea was to start working immediately. Before the next Grand Prix in Monaco, Senna also took advantage of Gerhard Berger's presence to mention a concern he had been keeping to himself. The speed of the safety car during the formation lap, something that would end up being crucial hours later. After the meeting, something totally unexpected happened. Ayrton ran into Alain Prost, and instead of ignoring him like he usually did, he stopped to talk. He told him that not everything was as it seemed, that he wasn't his enemy, and that if something happened to him, he wanted him to carry on the cause of safety in his name. Prost was surprised by this. Years later, the Frenchman said, "I was very surprised. Normally, you wouldn't even greet me if we crossed paths." The morning went on. As race time approached, Senna's behavior became much more introspective. He wasn't communicative, he didn't make jokes, he didn't smile. Later, his engineers described him as serious but different, as if his mind was no longer there. And right before the race, Sid Watkins tried one more time. He asked him not to race, to think about what was at stake, but Senna was clear and replied, "I can't give up," and he didn't. Even though all the signs were there, even though fear surrounded him, even though his instinct was screaming that something was going to happen, he didn't give up and kept going. He had secured pole position on Friday, even though he didn't go out to qualify on Saturday after Ratzenberger's accident. Next to him on the front row was Michael Schumacher. And in that way, everything was set for what would end up being the greatest tragedy in the history of the sport. From the very first second, everything was a disaster. As soon as the lights went out, JJ Leto's car was completely stopped on the grid. And seconds later, Pedro Lamy crashed into him from behind at over 180 km/h. The impact was so violent that pieces of carbon fiber flew like shrapnel. They crossed the barriers and landed directly on the crowd. 9 people were injured, 8 spectators and a police officer. They were in an area that should never have been so close to the track, but no one cared about that. And what did the organizers do after the accident? Nothing. They didn't stop the race. They didn't assess the damage. They didn't check on the crowd. Nothing. They just brought out the safety car, a regular Opel Vectra with no preparation to control a group of Formula 1 cars. The same one that had already been a cause for concern in the previous drivers' meeting. Senna and Berger had warned that this car wasn't fast enough to keep the tires up to temperature. Ayrton, who was leading, was desperately gesturing for the car to go faster, but it was useless. It was so slow that the tires and brakes of the cars cooled down dangerously. And in an era without traction control or assisted brakes, that was a recipe for disaster. Later, it was revealed that the safety car's brakes had overheated on the first lap and started to fail. The safety car driver himself had to slow down to avoid causing an accident. Years later, he admitted that the car was not suitable, and he couldn't understand how anyone had approved its use in a competition of that level. However, there it was, at the worst moment, in the wrong place, with no margin for error. And all because Formula 1 was still willing to play with the lives of its drivers to protect its money. Once the debris was cleared and the safety car was withdrawn, the race was restarted. At the end of lap 5, Senna was in the lead. Behind him, Michael Schumacher was following closely. They were driving almost bumper to bumper. And while Michael was putting on the pressure, Ayrton responded, because despite the full tank and the still cold tires, Senna was flying on the track. Schumacher couldn't match the leader's speed and started to fall behind quickly. This worried Professor Sid Watkins. He felt that something was wrong. He turned to Mario Kaysen and said quietly, "There's going to be a damn accident at any moment." And unfortunately, he was right. On lap 7 with Senna still in the lead, his Williams went straight on as he reached Tamburello, a very high-speed corner with no escape route. He was going at 305 kilometers an hour, and even though he managed to break down to 211, it wasn't enough. The car crashed violently into the concrete wall. The right front wheel, along with part of the suspension, broke off and went through his helmet. This caused fatal fractures to his skull and irreversible internal bleeding. Senna was not moving. The cameras for a moment showed the image, and although they cut away quickly, it was already too late. The silence of the circuit said more than any report, and when the doctors arrived, his head turned a few millimeters. That was the only sign of life. At 2:17 p.m. local time, the red flag was shown and the race was stopped. After the doctors worked to remove the driver from the car and assist him, Senna was transported by helicopter to the Maggiore Hospital in Bologna, but everyone knew he would never get into a car again. In his cockpit, they found a small Austrian flag. Senna planned to pay tribute to Roland Ratzenberger if he won the race, but he couldn't do it. And despite everything that had happened, and what could still happen, the event didn't stop, because there was still a race to finish. But first, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe. It was 37 minutes from the time Ayrton Senna was evacuated by helicopter until the race was restarted. 37 minutes of uncertainty, silence, and fear, but it wasn't enough. Because when they removed the remains of the Williams, the race continued as if nothing had happened, as if they didn't have a driver in critical condition. There was no suspension, there was no cancellation. No one at the FIA spoke up to say enough was enough. What happened at Tamburello was more than enough reason to stop the race, but they didn't do it. Because even if no one said it out loud, it was clear, the show had to go on. Just a few laps later, during a pit stop, the right rear wheel of Michele Alboretto's Minardi came off as he was leaving the pit lane.
Something terrible is happening in the pits.
It flew off, crossed the pit lane, and hit 2 Ferrari mechanics and 2 Lotus mechanics. All of them had to be hospitalized. It was the 3rd consecutive day with serious injuries, and still, it wasn't enough. Niki Lauda, Gerhard Berger, and even Bernie Ecclestone, one of the most powerful men in the paddock, asked for the race to be suspended immediately. But the request was denied, and the race went on. The business was already underway, and as I said, the show had to go on. After everything that happened, the race ended, and Michael Schumacher was the winner.
Schumacher was the winner, ergo grasso, and boxing was also a winner.
But he didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no music, no smiles. At the podium ceremony, out of respect for Roland Ratzenberger, the traditional champagne shower was omitted, and at that moment, Senna's true condition was still unknown. That podium was the quietest in the history of Formula One, and it reflected exactly how the paddock felt. Disoriented and paralyzed. No one knew how to react to what had just happened. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix stopped being a competition and became a procession of tragic events that no one dared to stop. And although the race ended, the drama was just beginning. For hours, no one said anything. There were moments of absolute tension. There was no official statement, not a single confirmation. Only rumors, confusion, and an overwhelming silence. At the press conference after the race, Michael Schumacher, who had won that day, said the following.
I can't feel satisfied. I can't feel happy.
It was only at 6:40 p.m., more than 4 hours after the accident, that Ayrton Senna's death was publicly announced. However, the official time on the report was different. 2:17 p.m., the exact moment of the impact. That meant the confirmation was delayed by almost 5 hours. When the doctors took him out of the car, there was still an almost imperceptible heartbeat. And as I mentioned earlier, according to Italian law, if a driver died on the track, the race had to be canceled immediately and a criminal investigation would be opened. On the other hand, if he technically arrived alive at the hospital, his death would be officially declared there and the Grand Prix could continue. That tiny heartbeat became the perfect excuse, because with Senna alive on paper, the race continued and the money kept coming in. That's why the FIA and the organizers delayed the announcement for almost 5 hours. 5 hours of silence, calculation, and coldness. It wasn't the same kind of cover-up as with Ratzenberger, but the result was the same. The show and the money were put above the lives of the drivers. The legendary BBC commentator Murray Walker summed it up bluntly: "This is the blackest day for Grand Prix racing that I can remember." When it was finally made official, the impact was global. In Brazil, the government declared 3 days of national mourning. On May 5, 1994, a state funeral was held. Around 500,000 people lined the streets to watch his coffin pass by. The ceremony was massive, filled with emotion, and his coffin was carried by several drivers. Among them was Alain Prost, his old rival, a scene as symbolic as it was heartbreaking. Meanwhile, Roland Ratzenberger, the other driver who had also lost his life that weekend, was given a private farewell. His funeral was held on May 7th in Salzburg, Austria. Drivers Gerhard Berger and Johnny Herbert attended, as well as Max Mosley, the president of the FIA. Years later, Mosley explained his decision. "I went to Ratzenberger's funeral because everyone went to Senna's. I thought it was important that someone went to his. I was right. One became a legend, while the other was forgotten. That weekend took 2 lives and changed history forever. But it also exposed the worst of a system that preferred to stay silent, move on, and make money even with blood on the track. And even though the situation was critical, what came next was even worse." After so many accidents and so much pain, justice failed. An investigation was opened, leading to the longest and most frustrating trial Formula One has ever faced. 6 people were charged with involuntary manslaughter: Frank Williams, Patrick Head, and Adrian Newey from the Williams team. Federico Bendinelli, representing the owners of the Imola circuit. Giorgio Paggi, director of the circuit, and Roland Brutzenreth, race director and responsible for approving the track layout. The case was reopened several times over the course of 11 years between trials, expert reports, appeals, and excuses. And in the end, everyone was acquitted. Despite the evidence, there were no convictions. The prosecution pointed to a clear cause: the breakage of the steering column. It was proven that it had been modified in an improvised way and poorly welded to adapt to Senna's posture. A poorly done weld that couldn't withstand the forces of the race and broke just before the impact. Even though they knew it, the team let him race, and no one made sure to check if that modification could withstand a race at over 300 kilometers per hour. The Italian Court of Appeals itself confirmed it in 2007 with the following statement: "It has been determined that the accident was caused by a failure in the steering column. This failure was caused by poorly designed and poorly executed modifications. The responsibility for this falls on Patrick Head, who was found guilty for failing to supervise. Even so, Patrick Head was never arrested. The verdict came when the statute of limitations for involuntary manslaughter had already expired in Italy, and that's how it all ended. Despite all the evidence, the accused were acquitted or protected by the statute of limitations. There were no guilty parties, not a single punishment, not a single legal consequence, just one more death erased from history. The most symbolic and painful accident in motorsport was left without justice. Another proof that, in that Formula One, not even the life of a legend was safe. And the greatest tragedy in the history of the sport had to happen for changes to finally be made. But first, if you're enjoying this video, subscribe. The greatest driver of his generation had to die for something to change. And when it finally happened, Formula One could never be the same again. The circuits were the first to be transformed. The Imola layout from 1994, which had been in use since 1981, was never used again. Tamburello, the corner where Senna died, was modified. More barriers, more runoff areas, and more safety measures were added. On the other hand, the cars also changed. The chassis, suspensions, and cockpits were redesigned. They were made stronger and safer. Helmets were updated. The hand system was implemented. The survival cell was reinforced, and medical protocols were strengthened and emergency measures were expanded. In addition, as a result of this situation, the GPDA returned. The Drivers' Association, which had been inactive for years, was reactivated at the initiative of the drivers themselves. The drivers, who were no longer willing to keep being ignored, and for the first time in a long time, the FIA listened. They didn't do it out of conviction, but because of pressure, because the whole world was watching. Because after losing Roland and Ayrton, no one dared to risk another life. Max Mosley, president of the FIA at that time, confirmed it when he said the following: "If it hadn't been Ayrton, we definitely would have continued in the same way and there would have been another death in 4 or 5 years." And even though it's hard to believe, that accident saved many lives, because for 20 years, Formula One didn't lose another driver in a race. A legacy written in blood, written on the weekend that will forever be remembered as the greatest tragedy in the history of Formula One. A series of mistakes, of ignored warnings, of decisions that prioritized the show over life itself, and also of bad luck. Because if the steering column had been 15 centimeters higher or lower, Ayrton would have walked away from the car. That day, the whole world saw one of the greatest of all time die in a race that should never have been run. Because if the drivers' complaints about safety had been listened to, Ratzenberger and Senna would still be alive. Or if the FIA had respected its own rules, the safety car would have gone out on track that Sunday. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix was not only a dark weekend, but it was also the weekend that changed the history of Formula One forever. And although this was the sad end of Ayrton Senna's life, his achievements will never be forgotten. Like the day when, despite being an inexperienced young man just starting his career in Formula One, he humiliated 9 world champions with the same car. So watch this video to learn about the beginning of Senna's legend and one of the greatest feats ever seen in motorsport.